I'm so glad that you guys are all here. I am very excited about today's program. As an interesting aside, Sally, who's speaking today, when we first reached out to her about doing our program today, it was actually not me. It was Kevin. So Sally is actually the only High Noon 2025 program that Kevin had scheduled before he passed. And so today is really kind of a way for us to acknowledge the vision that he had for us, in addition to the fact that I'm just stinking excited to hear from her today. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we jump in. Tomorrow's walking tour is sold out, which is really exciting, but we have some incredible walking tours left on the schedule. So if you have not signed up for them, please do. They're amazing. Not because I give some of them, but because they're really cool, including a brand new one, The Homes by Cohagen. So we still have that one on the books for a couple of weeks. We also, on July 26th, please mark your calendars at 1 p.m. July 26th is the 35th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the act is only 35 years old. I am older than federal protections for people with disabilities. We are celebrating that anniversary this year with a free screening of the Oscar-nominated film Crip Camp. It is a phenomenal film. I love it. And so we are offering that viewing for free in partnership with Lyft, Eagle Mount, and the Montana Center for Inclusive Education. That will be at 1 p.m. at Petro Hall at MSUB, and I really hope you guys are able to come out and support us and support the people with disabilities in our communities, because it's a really, really wonderful opportunity for us. We also have several exhibit changes coming up, in addition to an exhibit that is only a week old. The exhibit here to my right on Joseph Henry Sharp just opened last week, and the photographs that you see in that exhibit are on loan to us from the Charlie Russell Museum out of Great Falls. So it's a really wonderful opportunity for you to see those pieces as well, because they are not in this part of the state very often or for very long. All right, so that's all that we have going on. It's not enough, right? There's always something else to add to our list. I am going to encourage you guys, if you have your phones out, to please go ahead and hit silent on them. We are streaming our program today, and so if somebody's phone goes off in the middle of it, you will be memorialized forever as having interrupted the program. And I don't think anybody wants that. Okay, so it is my honor today to introduce anthropologist Sally Thompson. She is an experienced presenter and workshop leader whose career in the Rocky Mountains and American Southwest has spanned more than 4 decades. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado in 1980, the same year she moved to Missoula. She has worked as an archaeologist, ethnohistorian, educator, filmmaker, tribal consultant, and collaborator. Her 2015 book, People Before the Park, was a collaboration with the Kootenai Culture Committee and the Pikuni Traditionalist Association of the Blackfeet Tribe. She has 2 books that were released in 2024, Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, 23 Unexpected Stories That Awaken Montana's Past, and Black Robes Enter Coyote's World. Sally enjoys engaging people in the rich fabric of Montana's cultures and history. We do have several copies of Sally's books here available today. I encourage you that if you don't already have one, grab one and she will autograph it for you. Sally's program is usually available through the Montana, or through Humanities Montana and their Montana Conversations program. Because of the defunding of that program, we have had some incredible sponsors step up so that we could continue to provide Sally's amazing programs today. So special thanks to Michelle and Conrad Karen for really encouraging and making it possible for us to continue this program, as well as Boot Hill Inn. Boot Hill Inn stepped forward in a great way to support us as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sally. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, Lauren.
Thank you all for taking time out of your lives today to join me, and want you to bear with me. I have an injury that's going to make me a little more awkward than usual, and Lauren has created a
tentative stand here for this mic, so hopefully I'm not going to knock it over. So you need me to speak up a little bit? Okay. And I don't want to touch this. I will just try, and will you wave at me if you, because I tend to kind of drop back. So as Lauren introduced, I have these 2 books out that are very different in nature, but the subjects overlap. So one of them, the Black Robes book, I've been researching for 20-something years, and it just took forever. I actually had 3 iterations of this book to get to its culmination, and that, for any of you who are writers, you just know, man, you think you finished a manuscript and then you realize you've got to almost scratch it and start over. But every iteration I learned, and so it just took forever. In the meantime, while waiting for University of Nebraska Press to decide if they were going to take it, a friend of mine said, why don't you write those stories you like to tell of my experiences in the field? And thought, no, it's not a bad idea, you know, and that one just cranked out. It was easy and pleasant to write, and the other one was grueling and interminable. And then that funny collision that they would both come out at the same time. So I'm going to weave them together a bit today because I was looking for the themes in these books that overlap with this area, with the Yellowstone and the Mussel Shell and Crow Country. So some of you may have seen the map of tribal homelands in Montana that's often in schools and museums, and my team at the university created that 20 years ago now, I think. And my goal for that project was that people would know whose homeland they live in. So that is a lingering legacy that I feel really great about, because it's so easy to look and go, oh, look at where we are relative to different tribes. So I'll call this Crow Country. I think you all do anyway, right? So one story in this book is directly about Crow Country, and I'm not going to read from the story other than the very beginning to give you a little glimpse of it, and then might even get you to want to buy the book. Then the others are going to be, well, this is an unusual story, I'll just say that, as most of these are. The strange story of how a Crow chief found his way home. Joe Medicine Crow got a peculiar phone call in 1978, one that led to the reburial of a Crow chief who had died a century before. The call was from a woman in Virginia who had never been to Montana, and unless you count her strange visitations, had never met a Crow Indian. When renowned historian Dr. Medicine Crow told me this story, I wondered if the truly extraordinary tale had any corroborative evidence. Turns out it did. So I'm just going to leave it there. But the woman had visionary contact, and she didn't know who the person was, but this dream image kept showing her enough to bring it into the modern world and identify with a photograph and a place name. And as a result of all that, this chief's burial was recovered from Wyoming and brought home. So it really is an amazing story. I do want to say that I always work in collaboration with tribes. So I wouldn't have just told this story without having talked with people. And one caveat is that not all the Crow people believe this and were supportive of it, but enough were that it was a well-attended reburial, and many people participated. And that's just kind of how life is, right? None of us all line up on all subjects. These days, not very well on many subjects. Okay, wait, I want this one. Okay, one really exciting thing that happened in the research process. I found the name of a special agent that was assigned to the Salish, the Bitterroot Salish, to travel from their treaty, the Hellgate Treaty Council, to come across the mountains to Fort Benton, where they were to meet with all the bison hunting tribes to come to a peace treaty, to a peace agreement. And mostly it was about making the lands passable by non-Indian people. So the vision eventually of a cross-continental railroad through the area, and that people wouldn't have to worry about warring tribes on the Buffalo Plains. So I couldn't find out anything about this man other than a 2-page report that had been submitted and was in the National Archives. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be writing about him, I want to know a little bit about him. It's nice to kind of think about who are these people. He was a fairly young man when he was part of the Railroad Survey, and then did a good job. He was also an assistant illustrator who was supposed to kind of copy the images that were being made by Gustav Sohan and John Mix Stanley. How many of you are familiar with those records, the Railroad Survey, Northern Pacific Railroad Survey stuff? Northern. Okay, it's funny because they came right through Missoula, where I'm based. You know, lots of people who would know all about this, so I wouldn't tell much. But anyway, Isaac Stevens had just become the governor of the new territory of Washington, and he was given that position as well as leading the surveys for a railroad corridor. And that was in 1853. So this guy, Thomas Adams, young man, came along and then was assigned to accompany the Salish. Well, I just couldn't find anything. And you know, these days you Google and you think you're gonna get whatever you need. So I went back like a year later to see, well, maybe I can do a better job trying to find this guy. And you know, sure enough, like 8 pages down into the Google network, here was Princeton University Library, Thomas Adams. So I'm thinking, that would be cool. So it turns out the family of descendants of his had turned in these illustrated journals just a few years before. And Princeton had finally gotten everything scanned and even transcribed and made available to the public, including all this pretty impressive artwork. I'm sorry to say the artwork is in the back seat of my car, which isn't here. So I had hoped to share that with you today, and I'm not able to, but a lot of it is available in the books. You don't have to buy them, you're welcome to scan through and look at them. So his work led to a really remarkable story about the traveling in 1855. And then when I was looking at what matters about that for people here, it's about what the elders at the time recalled as the worst drought they had in memory. And then I realized there's an earlier story that also refers to a really terrible drought, in both cases in the Musselshell Valley, and then because of that, hunters coming into the Yellowstone in search of buffalo. So I'm going to start with the 1846 story, 1846, and then we'll move on to the 1855 story. Any questions before I launch in? Because I'm used to a crowd that's a little bit more into my knowledge base, and I'm into a different one here with you all. No, okay. Okay. De Smet departs St. Mary's. So how many of you are familiar with Father De Smet? Okay. And St. Mary's Mission was the first one, and it was in the Bitterroot Valley. And it was his most beloved center, and it only lasted from the founding in 1841 until 1850. And this story actually has a lot to do with the reason it failed, but I'm not going to get into all that, but this is about a story that overlaps the one that we'll do in 55. So while John C. Fremont and Kit Carson, 2 heroes of the day, were mapping a new route south of Mount Hood, Fathers De Smet and Point arrived at St. Mary's Mission in August 1846, but most of the Salish were gone. Short on food, they had gone for buffalo. The total sum available from stock and vegetables at the mission is far from adequate for the needs of the Salish and the resident Jesuits. So no matter how hard they tried to keep the Salish where they were in more of a settled life, they couldn't, so they were gone again for buffalo. I'm skipping through some because I don't want to take too much time. While De Smet dreamed of upcoming grandeur in an expanded Rocky Mountain mission, he was unaware that seeds he was about to plant would lead to the demise of St. Mary's in just a few short years. He and Father Point were headed eastward across the Rockies to meet with the Pikunni, the Piegan Blackfeet, the southernmost tribe of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Eager to catch up with the main Salish camp, the two priests headed east on August 6th, escorted by hunters, scouts, and translators who traveled with their Salish wives and children. From Hellgate Canyon, the two Black Robes and their entourage traveled over a gentle pass across the divide and headed toward the Three Forks. With each passing day, the priests grew more anxious that they had yet to locate the Salish village. 2 days' journey past the Three Forks, they rejoiced when they came upon the remains of a camp and could identify who had been there. I love these details that are otherwise kind of lost to history. Along with the Salish, Nicholas and Sata, and they were both of the Small Robes band of the Pikunni, or the Blackfeet. And they were the motivating factor for getting the priests to go introduce Christianity to the Blackfeet. They were friends and living among them. So they, quote, recognized the poles used as a means of transport by their tribe, the Travois, and saw pickets such as only the Nez Perce employed. There's so little known about how they were keeping horses contained. They didn't corral them. And so, picket type that was unique to the Nez Perce, but then of course they don't give the details, so we don't know what they were. The priests thanked God that they were finally on the trail of the Flatheads, and at the same time they felt concern about this particular alliance. Just a year before, the Crows had slaughtered a good portion of the men and boys of the Small Robes band of Blackfeet and captured scores of women and children. The united forces of Salish, Nez Perce, and Small Robes were likely moving toward trouble. So I want to tell you a little background on why they are where they are, why, and worried about this, what happened. And this oral history is so important and has often been neglected. Some of you who are older, probably learned how you can't really rely on oral history and that written history is somehow superior. And I've kind of come to believe the opposite. Happy to talk to anybody who has thoughts about that. But in this case, Margaret Armel Deshaw, born to a Blackfeet mother and a French father, at the age of 10, recalled her memories about a battle between the River Crow and Piegan in the Musselshell country. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, maybe this is the same story, but it's just a similar story. Her story, which took place around 1830, documents the long feud between these tribes. She told it to a guy, Major General Hugh Scott, in 1923, so she was 103 years old. And just as an aside, Hugh Scott was really fascinated by sign language, and the Crows were particularly fluent, and they still have some really talented sign talkers. Well, Hugh Scott went around recording with a video, an early camera, motion picture camera, people telling stories and making signs, but he wanted to be the one to demonstrate what the different signs were. And he was missing 2 fingers. And he's there, just think about the arrogance. Why the heck didn't he get a good native sign talker to be doing this? But he wanted to do it. And you can't read the signs because he's missing some digits. Anyway, his record of what she said. She said, I have been thinking of a battle on Flat Willow Creek between the Piegan and the River Crows, in which the Crows were nearly wiped out. We had been in the Musselshell country but could find no water, so we moved out. The Piegan men had gone out hunting when the Crows attacked the camp from the rear and captured all the women. This was when I was about 10 years old. I succeeded in hiding and was not taken. When the hunters returned, they went in pursuit of the Crow, and in a 4-day battle, they killed most of the Crow and retook the women. So of the River Crows, apparently a really major portion of them died at that time. I have not asked people within the community about, because this was coming from the Blackfeet side, and I'm not sure, but this other story is from the Crow. It was at the time when Hair on Top, oh, I want to say that this is an oral history from Elias Goes Ahead, and it was recorded in 2004. And it's also between the crows. This one doesn't say river or mountain crow, but between the crow and the small robes. It was at the time when Hair on Top, Doubleface, and Slow were the war chiefs among the crows. They were camped in the upper Muscle Shell. Their scouts were wolfing around the Judith Gap area. And that's in quotation marks, so I'm assuming that doesn't mean they were wolf hunting. I think it's like scouting, like wolves would do to find their prey. So around the Judith Gap area, which the crows call the spotted fish country. When they saw the small robes camp of women, children, and old men, while their hunters were many miles away. So he goes on to recount what happened, and that they thought, you know, we can really take them. They're just old men in the camp. We'll kill them and we'll steal the women and children. And with so much death in these days because of the influence of disease brought in by the fur traders and warfare, they really needed some new blood in these communities. So stealing women and also accepting men, like the Salish accepted so many Iroquois that came in with the fur trade into their communities, and it helped because they had lost so many. So anyway, this would look like this is going to be an easy taking because the men were gone, but the men returned right when they were starting to move in, and the crows still won. They figured out a way to kind of enclose, surround the Blackfeet, and the memory was that they once surrounded, and when the battle was over, 100 men were killed among the small robes. Every one, he said, every one that tried to defend himself, they were ridden down and clubbed to death. Then some of the small robes did survive. There was actually about between 50 to 80 lodges of small robes band that were destroyed. And that 80 was probably about as many as there were. So people have, thought maybe they were pretty much wiped out, but it turns out there were maybe 2/3 of them killed in this one battle. But the crow got away with the women and children. And there's a lot of really interesting oral history there where those women remained, even when there were efforts to try and negotiate some sort of deal and get some of them to come back to the Blackfeet. At that point, they were married in. They had children. They had, their lives would have been too disrupted. So at least the records I've seen, the women generally did not go back. But just think about a life like that, where the women certainly were pawns in the bigger story. So the background to the story of the two priests relates to this story. So why they're worried when they see that these tribes that have it out for the crow are camped together, and they seem to be moving quickly in the direction of the crows. So, and there's background that I think would take a little too long to explain, but there was a meeting with De Smet and the crow when he was leaving this area in 1840, when he was on his own scouting trip, and at that time, he baptized a lot of crow, and they were thinking, like other tribes, this is going to be extra power for us. If we accept this as part of our medicine, we'll do better. And then when they got so wiped out in what we're going to just read, they thought this isn't working for us at all, and so kind of pulled away from that. But one of the small robes was with the surviving small robes lodges, some of them went and lived with the Salish. They were, everybody's Blackfeet and Salish are enemies, but this one band, the small robes band, which was a large band before these battles, they were really good trading partners and pretty intertwined with the Salish. And so some of them went and lived among them, and this Nicholas and Sata, his son, were part of that group. And they really believed in the power of Christianity. And then there were others who just joined up more with the larger pagan bands. And so this is the occasion where Nicholas has talked the priests into going and introducing Christianity to his relatives among the Picani. That's how they would say it. So back to just going to see. So they had a really hard time finding them, and finally sent some runners ahead, and then they came back and said, there's going to be a battle. There's been an initial battle, and they're afraid that the Crow are going to really retaliate the next day. So Desmet hurries on to try and convince them. That man had a big ego. I mean, here are these two warring tribes, and he, kind of on his own, is going to go and, with the power of the cross, convince them to back down. And he's a remarkable human. But they actually get there right after the battle has occurred, and the Blackfeet have dominated completely. And the Crow, I think there was some sickness among the Crow at the time, and they just were depleted, and they retreated into the mountains and then did not come back out. So there's a book called Wilderness Kingdom that was left by Father Nicholas Point, kind of like the Thomas Adams records. It's illustrated journals that he kept with him. They didn't go to the Missouri Jesuits headquarters where they were based. He moved on to, actually both priests during this journey, they were on their way to St. Louis, but they both had kind of been fired. So this is one thing people don't know about Father Desmet. In a way, he failed at his mission, and other priests were complaining about his overreach, that he was always promising too much, and then they were short on what they needed, the support they needed, and the funding they needed. And so the priests that were left at these missions were just struggling in an incredible poverty. I mean, really, sometimes starving. And so they complained to headquarters, and Desmet got called back to St. Louis, and he worked there for the rest of his life, till 1873. And Father Point, who was a peculiar man apparently, was sent to Canada to a school, to where he could teach at a school. And so he, while there, I think, pulled together these illustrated journals, and they're published in a book called Wilderness Kingdom that came out, I think, in 1968, and is still available. It's this big hardback color book. It's hard to figure it out because the arrangement of things, but there's amazing information in that, and all of his artwork. And he's like a modern artist. He's like a pointillist. Kind of funny since his name is Point. But you're using a technique that has not yet been invented. It hasn't become a well-known European style. So for any of you interested, that's actually available pretty cheap online. So that story leads to the story from Thomas Adams' journal about 1855, and just while they're waiting for the peace treaty the council to be held. So they are on their way to Fort Benton, and when they get across the mountains, a runner comes and tells them, we have to delay the council. The goods have not arrived. And that's all kind of in the record. You don't really know why. It's just that the goods haven't arrived. It's a slow journey up the river. Well, it turns out the Missouri River is almost dry, and so finally the boats get up to maybe around Fort Union, and then they put the goods in smaller boats, and then men are really pulling the boats up the sandy channels. And this story is, it takes place during this 2-month odyssey while waiting for the goods to arrive and the council to be held. So imagine you are a Salish person who has come over, and you're expecting to have this council and to be fed. You know, part of the thing of coming together with the council is you're going to get all these goods to take home, and you're going to, you know, be entertained, and you're going to leave with a peace agreement with you and your enemies. So it's pretty compelling to go, but now you're told just go out and keep in the area so we can send word when we're ready. And then that lasts for 2 months, and then when you listen to the conditions, it's really remarkable. Adams is glad to learn that he will be sent with a message to invite the Crows to the council. With 5 pounds of sugar and only enough fresh beef for 2 meals, he sets out on August 27th in the company of interpreters. One of them speaks the Crow language. On their first day out, the 8 men begin to learn the extent of the drought and are shocked by what they see. Arrow Creek is dry. They set up camp by a little spring-fed creek. The brackish water is undrinkable by itself. Fortunately, they have gathered peppermint and brought sugar along, as they are able to make a pot of peppermint tea. The men aren't the only ones seeking this little oasis of grass and water. Mosquitoes are relentless. After unsaddling his horse at the end of this tiring and discouraging day, an exhausted Adams lies down on his blanket, only to have a rattlesnake crawl out from under it. To avoid further surprises, he and Craig moved to a nearby hilltop out of the grass. The next day, traveling generally south-southeast, they can barely make out the Square Butte and the Beartooth through the smoky air. Then on August 29th, they find a camp on a branch of the Judith with water and wood, although grass remains a scarce commodity for their horses. On August 30th, Adams and party cross the Judith River, which is low but running. The grass is all burnt off in these sections. And I wonder, does that mean it's just burnt from the sun? Or as I read on through his journals, it seems like, people have to cook their meat with a fire outside, and the winds come up, and I think it's literally burned, like their fires have sparked the grasses in a wide area. It's so dry. So they head up a creek several miles and then cross into the Mussel Shell, where they find a small grassy tract that escaped the burn, and they camp. Adams is discouraged by what he sees. The prairie is so dry that any spark from a campfire can set it ablaze. That afternoon, they fight a strong wind, followed by a heavy shower of rain mixed with hail. Sounds like this summer. The hail, anyway. They camp about 10 miles south of a high round mountain, which is the furthest eastern spur of the Rocky Mountains in this latitude. You have any guesses what feature that is?
Snows. Rockies. The Rockies are the snows?
It's even farther. No, it's because they're up a little bit farther north. And I brought maps for anybody who's like equally fanatic to me, always trying to figure out where is this on the ground. I gave a talk in Lewistown and was convinced by people there that it's called Black Butte, that's at the eastern edge of the Judiths. And it really stands out. So some of you are going, oh yeah, that would make sense. Okay. So they, back in that day, they called it Finis Butte, like the Frenchman must have named it, so last butte. So an important landmark to know where they were. 2 days later, the Adams group leaves in the company of 2 Grovant representatives, because they're meeting some other bands and people trying to make a living in this time too while waiting for the council. And there's been a truce, they've all agreed with Isaac Stevens to not be fighting while they're waiting for the peace council, right? So they're camping together but in this case it's just the white men and their translators. The group proceeds through remarkably decimated land where the river's water stands in pools. The hunters bring in a buffalo bull and an elk, but they provide little food. Every being is depleted by this extraordinary drought. On September 5th, they have to spend the first part of the day in search of their wandering animals. With grass so scant, the horses break free of their tie lines whenever they can. The poor creatures are driven by hunger. So you get the idea. This is astonishing situation. And so the Nez Perce are also traveling with a different agent, and they decide they're going to the Yellowstone where they feel like they can get food. They're not going to wait in an area close enough to wait for Stevens. They're willing to risk not being represented at the treaty. This is a little aside, but for those of you who follow treaty law, the continuing rights, the off-reservation hunting rights of the buffalo, so the Nez Perce come over and hunt in Montana because of this treaty that they signed later this year of 1855. And then it's interesting, it explains why the Crow were not at this treaty, and I think also why the Shoshones weren't, when that was a traditional hunting area in the headwaters of the Missouri. So they're going to go, Agent Adams and some of his people are going to go down to the mid-Yellowstone, where there was a place called Meldrum's Fort, I think near the mouth of the Bighorn. Does anybody know that location? Were there this fort or familiar with it? I guess there was a series of forts there that were short-lived. So Meldrum was the agent at that time. And so they were going to go see if he had both some supplies and some food, and if he knew where the Crow were, because they were really trying to get the Crow to come to this council. And they're still just barely getting by, not finding food as they're going on these. So they set out August 27th. They set out for the Yellowstone. And Adams and his group had headed south from Fort Benton with the message with the message from the Crow that they had received from Governor Stevens. From the Nez Perce camp below them, the Salish had learned that the Crow, with whom they had wintered, so that Nez Perce had wintered, had been afflicted with the measles during the past summer, that 267 had already died, 8 of their headmen among them. Survivors had scattered in small bands through the mountains of the Yellowstone. So it's going to be really hard to find them. They're not gathered anywhere, and they're trying to avoid people because they don't want to keep contaminating each other. On September 13th, Adams, with one of the translators and a flathead named Nine Pipes, and one of the hunters head to the Yellowstone. So they hope to find this Meldrum's Fort. If they're lucky, they will find some Crow there as well, with meat for trading. From them, Adams hopes to learn the whereabouts of their headmen to tell about the council. For 2 days, his group travels along the river below the Bighorn River. They don't meet any Crow, but thankfully they do find grass, buffalo, and good water, the first they've seen for days. They relish the taste of juicy meat and marrow bones. The next day, they are greatly disappointed to pass 2 old burned trading posts. Meldrum's post seems to be no more, and the Crow are nowhere in sight. So the story goes on. They end up that this treaty was held not in Fort Benton. Does anybody know where it was held? 1855 Peace Council among the buffalo hunting tribes. It was at the mouth of the Judith, which is now a new state park. And the reason, the word went out from Governor Stevens that the goods were finally about to arrive, or they were coming up the river, and that the people should start heading to Fort Benton. And Chief Victor of the Salish had Agent Adams report that their horses and they themselves were too weak to go all the way. They were down at the mouth of the Mussel Shell, or almost, and they said, we just can't make it that far, but we could probably get to the mouth of the Judith. Well, it turned out it worked out really well for the agents as well, because the boats didn't have to travel as far. The council could happen earlier, and so that's where it was held. And that information was really not known. The details of all of that came through this recently discovered Thomas Adams journals at Princeton University Press, or library. So I think that's all I had prepared. and it's probably a good thing, because am I already over time?
Good time for questions.
Oh, good. So any questions or comments or shared information, things you know that I don't?
What would be the sort of the approximate population of those tribes at that time?
There is information. I think some of it's actually in the books. The West Side tribes had really come down to, I'd say, an average of about 500 people, and so like the Salish, 400 or 500, and the Pend Oreille the same. Kootenays, it's just hard to know because a lot of the Kootenai bands were up in Canada and a little more removed from what was going on. But yeah, their populations were way down from what they'd been, at the time of contact or pre-contact. There, it's a much larger group anyway through time, and I think it may be that there were like 6,000 or 7,000 Blackfeet at the council. And maybe more, the estimates vary. It was a huge camp, and most of them, the large majority were of the four nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And at that time, the Gros Ventres were kind of considered part of that as well.
What was coming in the boats besides the people negotiating the treaty? Were there, gifts, or, why were so many people gathered there?
This peace treaty was really important, I think, to all of them. I think by this time, everyone's depleted. The buffalo are getting harder to find already, even long before the railroads actually, we associate it so much with the demise with the railroad. But there's been so much displacement of people from farther east, so there are just more and more people fighting for for being the right to hunt, and then they're killing each other for that right. And so I think they're all kind of tired of it. And the promises made by the treaty negotiators that they would be supported, like Isaac Stevens, who the Blackfeet called him not tall man. So not short, it wasn't short man, it's not tall man, was what their word translates to. And they did not have much respect for him. There's a whole story in here about that comes through Adams' records that hadn't been really written about much, but there was also the governor of Nebraska Territory, because at that time Eastern Montana was not in Washington Territory. So Stevens is there representing the West Side tribes, and then Cummings is there for the East Side tribes. But he's from way down the lower Missouri, and he doesn't know any of these people, and he doesn't know much at all, really. But he's insisted that he is the one in charge because it's in his territory. So it's true. So Stevens had to back off, and Stevens was an arrogant man, and he didn't want to relinquish power. So the description, there's also a beautiful sketch, and I'm really sorry you can't see it, but I think it's actually in this book, of Stevens on horseback. But he's pacing. Adams describes him as pacing in about a 20-foot, that he created his own well-packed trail, just back and forth. That's what he was doing maybe the whole 8 weeks while waiting for the council. And so there was a lot of stress. But they promised a lot, and Stevens, the Blackfeet remember him saying, wouldn't you prefer cattle to buffalo? And the Blackfeet word for cattle is not real meat. So you're thinking, wouldn't you prefer not real meat to real meat? And the deep spiritual relationship with the Blackfeet, and gave all gifts really to keep them alive. No, they didn't prefer the cattle, but they were realizing there were benefits that would come to them if they would just agree to quit fighting, and then they were supposed to separate their hunting areas so there would be less conflict. Mm-hmm.
So the reason that there was so much warring between the tribes, was it because of territory? Why was that?
So the reason for so much war between the different tribes, scarce resources. Same reason we fight. really, right, to control the resource base.
I mean, Buffalo.
And buffalo was the staff of life. Yeah. For people in the Buffalo Plains, that was a predominant part of the diet. Of course, plants and berries and roots and all that, essential to good health and a balance, but the majority of the diet came from buffalo.
You mentioned the mortality rate in the Crow from the measles, and by that time had measles, I know it was quite deadly to all tribes, and by that time had they gotten it as far west that those tribes would have had resistance by now, or had they not yet been exposed?
No, interestingly, smallpox came so early, but the one example I know, and there's a lot of good data out there that some anthropologists have collected, and I'm just not up on it right now, but the one example was when Whitman, so, the missionary in the Walla Walla area, he had gone back east. He was really, he was a doctor and a missionary, but he was also one of the major people encouraging others to move west. And he had gone back east and then led the first wagon train, really, that kind of started the Oregon Trail, and brought like 200 people with him to the Walla Walla area, which was in the Cayuse homeland, and they'd never been asked. And some of those people brought, so that this was in 1840, I think, right around there. And so it was the first exposure, at least of those people on the Columbia, to measles, and they're one of the main reasons they started turning against Whitman was the white people were surviving it and the Indians were dying, and he was a doctor. So they thought he was actually trying to kill them. And so they ended up killing him and his wife and the other white people at that mission. But that would say that, no, they hadn't been exposed, so many of them were dying. And then I think any of the more remote, especially the mountain crow, just it had less exposure. And so as people were coming west on, both staying on the Oregon Trail, but the ones that were coming up to take advantage of one thing or another and coming up to the Yellowstone or over into our country up through the Bitterroot, they were bringing those diseases a little later than what we think of. Yeah.
What about from the west? California, Oregon, Washington?
Yeah.
Would there have been disease moving eastward then as well?
You may remember that in the Lewis and Clark journals, they note an old woman who had smallpox scars. So when they passed through there in 1806, so that there had been a lot of traffic on the Pacific coming into that area long before Lewis and Clark made their way west, and so there was a lot of disease coming from every direction. Yeah, and that's what some anthropologists have really focused on, the vectors and types and how that affected different populations, but it's not my area. But interesting stuff, huh? Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit, but I think it would be interesting to some of the people here. So when I was reading of the account when the expedition was trying to find the crows, and they came down from the last mountain, what do they call it?
Finney Butte or Last
Right.
Butte, yeah.
So I was trying to kind of trace where they came down to get to the Yellowstone, and I couldn't figure it out. From the descriptions, it just didn't mean anything. But then when I found out that they came out where the Bighorn went into the Yellowstone, then I could kind of vaguely trace it back. And kind of what I think they did is they went up Half-Breed Creek, which is like when you go into Roundup, and then went over the Bull Mountains and then down Railroad Creek. It would kind of fit. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Oh, and then the other part of that was, so they were talking a lot about that drought and they couldn't find food, and about the only thing they could find were these old decimated bulls, and that just eat the tongues. But I had heard, and I don't know, Tom, if you heard this, that the Bull Mountains were named the Bull Mountains because that's where they went to find, when they couldn't find any meat, they found these old bulls in Bull Mountains. So I was just wondering if that might be how the Bull Mountains got named when they were going through there and finding, because that's what they, when they're in the Bull Mountains, that's what they were finding, these old bulls. But that was pretty interesting.
Does anybody know about that place named for Bull Mountains? Yeah, and that story, that they went there, I think, knowing that they're going to find some meat there, but then it's hardly any meat. It's kind of hard to imagine a drought that bad. But then to see that also in 1830, it sounds like the mussel shell country was really, really dry, and I don't know. And Steve, I wish I would have had you come up and tell that, because I don't think everybody probably heard all you had to say, but the maps over here, for anybody interested, Steve could show you, where he thinks this trail went, and there's a great narrative, and it's like an adventure to try to figure out where in this story. And one of the maps I have like little tags, like I think this is here, but it's all guesswork. One of you,
Yeah, your book is in some ways almost a parallel biography of De Smet and
Chief Charlo.
I wonder how it seems like a bold idea, and I'm wondering how you thought of that and what led you to try to write it down.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you asking that, because that's, in terms of my journey, that's the crux of it. How did I come up with writing a book that's kind of a parallel biography of Chief Victor's son, Charlo, but it really covers from Victor's period through Charlo's life through 1910. And so the first version of the book was following Father De Smet through Indian country. And I really had pretty much written the first draft, and then I thought, this bores me. And nobody's going to want to, if it bores me, then nobody's going to want to read this thing. And I think it's just, a lot of people have written De Smet biographies. And I was trying to do it, I'm always trying to tell a story from a different point of view. We have mostly read stories written by white men who've come into the area, and then they tell it through that lens. And so often, the women's stories are almost invisible, and the native stories are all skewed through the lens of bigotry, judgment. So I'm always looking for the story that's not told, and I'm thinking, I can't tell it this way. And so I've worked with the Salish for years, and thought, here are these diplomats, Chief Victor and then his son, Charlo, who never went to war, they always took pride that they had never killed a white person. In all those years, they were treated well by many, but not by all, certainly. And that why don't we tell the story of diplomats? You go to any bookstore, Dorothy, you can vouch for this. The shelves are full of books about Lakota warriors, Blackfeet warriors, and we know their names. Comanche warriors, Apache warriors, Tecumseh, just throughout American history, we tell about those men who were warriors. Why aren't we telling the story of these Salish diplomats who kept the Salish from being exterminated, or the attempts to exterminate? And so I thought, I'm going to try and do that through this. Really, for me, the overarching theme is the comparison between how Euro-Americans and Native Americans relate to land and nature. So different. And yet we don't really dig into that. I mean, we've held up Native people as respecters of nature ever since Chief Dan George, for any of you old enough to remember that, with the tear coming down his face. And don't harm Mother Nature, or I don't remember what his tagline was, but we do it in a cursory way, but what's the reality? And so that this book starts with a speech given by Chief Charlo in 1876 on a cold February day, when he is outraged because the newly formed county commissioners of Missoula County, which was all of western Montana, are going to tax them on their property. in their traditional homeland, which at that time was still treaty protected. So he's talking to his people, and somehow a Missoulian reporter gets a translated version of this, and it's in the Missoulian. And otherwise this would be lost. It would have been lost to the tribe as well. And so I think he asks his people the question, what makes white people so mean and greedy? And he boils it down to they've been cast from their place of creation, and so they've lost their covenant with the Creator. And I think that's what I really want to talk about. So it's kind of woven through the story, just through their lives and the examples. And then I wasn't bored. I wanted to tell that story, and I realized it was a story I'd always wanted to tell. And that here was Charlot giving me the perfect, springboard for doing it. So what do the Salish think about me writing this? I think it's a little easier because it was a biography of both sides. I wasn't trying to just write a biography of their chief. And their spiritual leader, Johnny R. Lee, I know fairly well, and I asked him if he would read what I'd written about them and tell me if I should go ahead or not. And he became a really strong advocate, and he said he wished all of their people could read this because their young people have lost so much. And so on the cover, his blurb, I wish everyone in Western Montana would read this book. It presents an honest and respectful view of Salish history. So then another Salish friend said to me, it's like you've got a shield on your book. Because of course there are going to be people shooting arrows this way, but with Johnny's support, we did it. So I think, one more in the back, and then I think we're close to wrapping up.
If the food was the basis to have the tribes have odds with each other, for years and years and years, the food was plentiful. Why was at this time a food shortage?
I think it's a multi-factored answer. The question is about when the tribes have been fighting for a long time and food had been plentiful, what had happened to the buffalo population. And overhunting, partially because of tribes that had moved into the area getting hopscotched from the Great Lakes, and especially a lot of the extended Siouan-speaking peoples. Moving right into, the heart of what turns out to be kind of the mussel shell country was so much where it ended up. So you have more people hunting. You have horses that make hunting more successful. You have the robe trade. So when the beaver trade ended, the bison robe trade, and it's hard to say who participated, but some of the native people, maybe they're mostly mixed bloods who had the encouragement to be doing it. But anyway, there was some overkill going on. And then when they learned they could make the belts to run machinery for the Industrial Revolution, that the best was bison hides, that just amped it up to beyond. But you had all those factors, and then you had these droughts. It was impacting the animals just like it was the people, and accumulation beyond help.
Lots of different reasons why there was a decline.
Mm-hmm. And there are probably others that I haven't mentioned, and happy to visit about it. Well, I think we're good. We're right at 1 o'clock.
Sally, can I provide just a little bit of contextual information to an earlier question?
Sure.
So the question about disease and population, a lot of historians see the first smallpox epidemic hitting Montana in 1750. And according to oral tradition and government records, the Crow population in 1830 is estimated to be about 600 lodges, which is roughly 6,000 people. There was a smallpox epidemic in 1833. In 1835, the Crow population is 200 lodges. And so we can see how quickly, even with disease, in 80 years, smallpox have been in Montana, and still that population kills more than half of the Crow people. And so that's just one microcosm of an indigenous, impacts to an indigenous population by disease.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.